everybody. Hope you're well. And there's an interesting thought. I'm not sure if I may have said it. I don't think I did. That Chazal actually tell us that Sefer Bamidbar is divided into 3 books. And in fact, instead of there being 5 Chumashim, there are 7 Chumashim. And the first book of Bamidbar is until Vayi ben Soah Ha'aron, meaning Parshas Bamidbar, Naso, and Balotcha, half of Balotcha. Then the second Sefer are only 2 verses. 2 verses. It's called the second Chumash. Vayi ben Soah Ha'aron, when the Aron traveled, Moshe said, "Let your enemies be scattered." Uvenucho Yomar, and when it rested, Moshe said, "Shuva Hashem Rivavot Alfei Yisrael," return to the multitudes of the myriads of Israel. Only 2 verses, 85 psukim, 85 words rather, 85 words. 2 verses, 85 words. And then we have the rest of the book of Bamidbar. And Rav Tzadok explains that the concept of the... I didn't hear you.
85 syllabi.
85 letters, I'm sorry. 85 letters, yes. So Rav Tzadok explains that the 3 divisions of the book of Bamidbar is ideal, reality, and transition. The first part of Bamidbar is the ideal society of God. We have our camps, we have the Mishkan in the middle, we have Kedusha, everyone has their place, everyone has their role. There is unity within diversity, or diversity within unity. Every tribe has its own distinct derech of Avodat Hashem. We've spoken before that tribes are extremely important because the lesson of tribes is that Hashem does not want conformity. Achdut does not mean sameness. Achdut means a respect for different and divergent approaches in Avodas Hashem. So part 1 of Bamidbar is the sacred ideal. Part 3 of Bamidbar is the sordid reality of how that ideal failed to come to fruition. We have the story of complaining of the man, which is tava. Remember, Pirkei Avot says, kina, taiva, kavod, that jealousy, lust, and honor-seeking take a person out of the world. They destroy the olam haba, they destroy olam hazeh. And what is the second half of Bamidbar but iteration after iteration of jealousy and lust and kavod seeking? Meaning to say, that's kind of the cost of individualism. In other words, the Torah is obviously very multifaceted, and if indeed the Torah emphasizes the importance within communities of people being individuals, pursuing their own needs, their own spiritual aspirations, the downside of that is that sometimes individuality runs amok and you destroy the whole fabric of Achdus. And that's really the kind of the second half of Bamidbar, where everybody is doing their own thing, seeking their own agenda, as we'll see with Korach. So part 1 is the ideal, part 3 is the sordid reality. That little part 2, the 85 letters, that little part 2 is the reason for the Nefilah, and that is, at that point, the Jewish people left Mount Sinai. They were at Mount Sinai for an entire, almost a year, 11 months and 3 weeks. They came Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and they left the 22nd of Iyar the next year. And it says, Vayisu mehar Hashem. They traveled, they ran away from the mountain of God. Rashi explains from Chazal that when they left Har Sinai, when they finally got the signal to leave Har Sinai, they were ketinok haboreach mi beis hasefer, right? You might remember the feeling, you have your own kids, the feeling of a child, the last day of school, summer vacation, tinok haboreach mi beis hasefer, because their attitude was, hey, we've been here a year, and we got 613 mitzvahs. If we would stay longer, who knows how many more mitzvahs we're going to get. Baruch Hashem, we're out of here. Of course, that didn't help them because they continued to get mitzvahs throughout the entire 40 years of the desert. So, Rav Tzadok says that's what happens. When your attitude towards the Torah, towards Avodas Hashem, is that it's a burden, it's a bother, it's an imposition, then you lose all the spiritual benefits and then you disintegrate. So So therefore, part 2 is the mavar, the transition between the ideal and the reality, based on Tinok haboreach mibeit hasefer. Now, Rav Tzadok points out that if you look in the Sefer Torah, it's also in the Chumash, you will see that Vahi ben Soah Ha'aron is bracketed in an unusual way. It is bracketed by really, it looks like a parenthesis. It's an inverted nun. It's a nun that is turned inward and upside down. So it's called nun hafuch, nun hafucha, nun hafuch. And Rav Tzadok says, what is the symbolism of nun? So we find in Chazal that nun is a letter that is connected to the musag of nefilah, falling down. It's a very famous Gemara, Mipnei ma lo nemar nun bi'ashrei. Right, Ashrei has a pasuk beginning with every letter of the alphabet, except, at least in our version of Tehillim, the Dead Sea Scroll, we actually have a nun, but in the part that was canonized in our Kisvei HaKodesh, there is no nun. We go from Malchutcha Malchut Kol Olamim to Somech Hashem. We skip the nun, and Rav Yochanan explains that we don't have a nun in Ashrei because nun is about nefilah, falling, as the Navi Amos said, Nafla lo yisaisif kum b'silas Yisrael. He did not want to begin with nefilah. However, in the next verse, when it talks about Hashem picking us up, it actually says, Somech Hashem l'chol hanoflim. So Rav Tzadok says, Tinok haborech mibeit hasefer is nefilah. And that's why it's bracketed. That attitude is because of nefilah. But he says very beautifully, why are the nuns reversed? Because the Torah is merames to a very important lesson. No matter how far you have fallen, no matter how low you have gone, nefilah is a reversible condition. Nefilah can always be turned around. A person cannot give up hope. A person can never feel they're on a path of no return. In fact, that's very, very yesoded. I mean, not all, but many of the Sifrei Musar make the point that there may be a primary Yetzer Hara that causes me to sin. A Yetzer Hara, whatever, a taiva. But then there's a secondary Yetzer Hara that is that voice within you that says, I've made so many mistakes, there's no point in trying to correct it. And that second Yetzer Hara is actually more pernicious and more poisonous than the first Yetzer Hara. Because the first Yetzer Hara caused you to make a mistake once. The second Yetzer Hara gives you the attitude and the feeling of despair that there is no hope, there is no makom for me to come back. And therefore the Torah is merames that even in nefilah, as low as one goes, there is haficha, there is the ability to reverse it and the like. Indeed, that might be one of the meanings. There are a number of meanings of the famous pasuk in Mishlei, one of the famous psukim in Tanakh, Sheva Yipo Tzadik V'kam. The Tzadik falls 7 times and he gets up again, meaning the Tzadik also makes mistakes. The Tzadik also sins. Ein Tzadik B'aretz in Kohelet Asher Yaseh Tov V'lo Yechateh. Right? There is no Tzadik who does good and never sins. But the difference is that Tzaddik does not allow his falling to immobilize him and to paralyze him. He gets up again. Right? This is kind of a general perspective. So now obviously we're in the middle of part 3 of Bamidbar. Last week we read the sin of the spies, for which it was decreed that the Jewish people would stay in the Midbar for 40 years, another 38 and a half years. Now this week we read about this awesome rebellion against Moshe, which resulted in a tremendous miracle of the ground opening up, etc. Now there is a big machlokas rishonim about chronology here. Some actually place the story of Korach chronologically before the spies, based on the argument that for the 38 and a half years that we wandered in the desert after the spies, Hashem did not even talk to Moshe. It's an amazing thing. You'll see it next week, actually. The Torah just flies over the 38 and a half years and brings you to the last year in the desert. And therefore, that the only event that occurred during after the spies that the Torah records is Korach. And because of that, many Rishonim actually learn that Korach occurred earlier. Others say it occurred after the Meraglim. But be it as it may, What is Korach's argument? Korach makes the argument of what you might call radical egalitarianism. He says, Kol ha'edah, kulam kedoshim. We don't need rabbis. We don't need interpreters of the Torah. We all heard from God the first two commandments. Right? Anochi, I am the Lord your God. Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim. You shall not have other gods. So essentially, Korach's argument, as Rav Soloveitchik describes it, was the common sense rebellion. We don't need authority. We don't need hierarchy. We don't need people to tell us what the Torah means, even Moshe Rabbeinu. We can do it ourselves. It reminds me a little bit, around maybe 15 years ago, I remember hearing on the radio that in Seattle, Washington, anarchists were trying to have a convention of anarchists, but they couldn't get it organized. Because, everyone's an anarchist. You want to meet here? No, I want to meet here. How do you, right? Without leadership, it's very, very difficult to do things. So the problem I want to address is the following. Korach seems to raise the banner of egalitarianism, participatory democracy. Everybody's equal. Every man a king. Again, the issue is what would he have done with the women? That's another interesting issue. And yet, Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't answer that. Moshe Rabbeinu talks about how much honor and how much kavod Hashem gave to the Leviim. Korach is a Levi. Rav lachem b'nei Levi. God gave you honor, God gave you glory, God gave you prestige. Isn't the honor enough for you? But the problem was, Korach wasn't making that argument. Korach wasn't saying, I'm not being treated right, I want a better position. Korach is saying, there ought not to be leadership, we're all equal. So in some ways, Moshe Rabbeinu is not responding to the issue that Korach brought up. Korach brings up equality, and Moshe Rabbeinu brings up hierarchy and saying, hey, you're pretty high up, you shouldn't feel bad. The answer must be that Moshe Rabbeinu understood that although Korach is using the vocabulary of equality, in reality, the true driving force is his own desire for kavod and leadership. This is often true in revolutions. Think, for example, if you remember George Orwell's parody of the Russian Revolution, Animal Farm. So what was Animal Farm about? It was about the animals who were being oppressed, they were being mistreated. So they stood up and they replaced the owners to establish freedom and equality for all beasts of burden. And what eventually happened was that some of the animals became dictators and ruled over the others in a very abusive way. This was the Russian Revolution. The Tsar gets overthrown because the Tsar was oppressive, the Tsar was despotic. And in the interest of a greater equality, again, communism had a certain appeal. Lubavitch Rebbe even talked about he knew very religious Jews, who idealistically believed in the idea of communism as a way of sharing, right? It sounds, on some superficial level, it sounds attractive. Karl Marx's formulation, or was it Engels, I don't remember which one said it, the famous statement, from each, to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities. What a beautiful idealistic thing. I contribute as much as I can to the community, and each person gets what they need. So there was tremendous idealism. And yet, what did you get? You got Lenin, you got Stalin, right? Stalin, who murdered more people than even Hitler. Not Jews, but many, many Jews, but Stalin murdered millions and millions of people. And people like Phnom Penh, if you listen to the rhetoric of these people, they talk about equality, human rights, human dignity. And then they murder mercilessly millions of people who they believe are not standing up for their ideals of human dignity. So one of the interesting things that Moshe Rabbeinu sees in Korach is that sometimes the language of democracy, egalitarianism, populism is really a mask for one power structure to take over from another power structure. And there was a woman who saw this, Mrs. On Ben Pellet. Now, On Ben Pellet is only mentioned once in the whole Torah, Korach assembled his group of rebellious people, Dasan and Abiram, who of course are well-known troublemakers. We know about them all the time.
How did they get out from Egypt?
Huh? How did they get out? Yeah, it's a very good question, because four-fifths died, and they made the cut of the one-fifth. But the answer is, Dasan and Abiram had one very, very big zechut. They were the shotchim, they were taskmasters, and they refused to reveal to Paro any identity of a Jew who did not do his quota, and that's a tremendous, tremendous zechut. So even they had something very special about them. Now, the thing is, all right, so Dasan and Abiram, we know, they have a history. On ben Pelas comes out of nowhere. We never hear about him. And yet, it also is not recorded that he died. You know, Dasan and Abiram died, etc. On ben Pelas. So what happens? The Gemara Sanhedrin says, Mrs. On ben Pelas, we don't know her name, talked him out of it. You know, he was very excited about populist talk. Yeah, equality, we're all equal, we're all going to be leaders here, every man a king. And she said to him, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, you know, you're an idiot. If Moshe wins, you're certainly going to be in trouble. And if Korach wins, you think you're going to be somebody. He's going to become the boss, and either way you'll be a nobody. So why are you getting involved? And she convinced him not to go. And just to be extra sure, it says that when the representatives of Korach went to convince him, she uncovered her hair, so they would not enter the tent. Even they were obeying this halacha, etc. She scared him away. And on the other side of the coin, Korach's wife incited him. When Korach brings up his issue, she kind of goads him on for the kavod and the glory. And the Medrash applies the pasuk in Mishlei. Shlomo Melech says in Mishlei, Chachmas nashim batzabeta v'yaveles v'yada tahar sena. That means the wisdom of a good woman builds a house up, and a foolish woman destroys a home. And the Gemara says, who is the wise woman who builds a home? This is the anonymous Mrs. On ben Pelas. And who is the foolish? Doesn't call her evil, but it calls her foolish. Who is the foolish, short-sighted woman who destroys a home? This is Korach's wife, who encourages him. So sometimes, the goal of a wife is to kind of ensure that her husband doesn't go off the deep end by doing things that may be very, very counterproductive. In fact, it's interesting that the great Knight of Yehuda, the great Rav of Prague, Rabbi Yitzchak Landau, in addition to his many, many tshuvos and many chidushim, he has a book of drashos, and in one of the drashos is the eulogy, the hesped he gave for his wife, for his rebbetzin. And he says, it's kind of an unusual personal note. Most hespedim that are printed are not particularly personal. But he writes that many times I was upset at the Kehillah for various things, and I wanted to, make angry statements, and she always talked me out of it. She always calmed me down, and she always made me see that was not the right thing to do. That's Chachmas Nashim Bansa Besa. Now, we see this in yet another way as well, because the Ibn Ezra writes the following. The Ibn Ezra writes, every single subgroup with Korach was seeking their own personal agenda. Korach had a personal agenda. Rashi identifies it. Rashi quotes from the Medrash Tanchuma the following idea, that Levi had three sons, Gershon, Kahas, and Merari. Kahas had four sons, Amram, Yitzhar, Chevron, Uziel. Amram had three children, Miriam, Moshe, Aaron. Yitzhar is Korach. Now here's the problem. Korach understood why Moshe and Aaron got two positions. Moshe was like the Melech, and Aaron was like the Kohen Gadol, because since Amram is the Bechor of Kahat, a Bechor gets a double portion, so Moshe and Aaron, from their father Aaron, gets a double portion. But Korach says, I am the son of the second son of Kahat, Yitzhar. And yet we find that Moshe designated Elitzafon ben Uziel, another cousin, the son of Uziel, as the head of the tribe of Levi. And Korach was jealous about that position. Korach basically said, Why are you giving that position? So Korach had a position that he wanted. Rashi Beferish says that Korach was arguing for the abolition of hierarchy, but his true motive was he wanted a position. And the Ibn Ezra goes on and shows every subgroup had their own agenda. Dashan ve'Aviram from Bnei Reuven. Bnei Reuven, they were the Bechor, they were the firstborn of Yaakov. They wanted a certain distinction in leadership that they didn't get. Others were Leviim, who wanted to be Kohanim, right? So Leviim wanted to be Kohanim. Bechor wanted to be Leviim. Korach wanted to be the Nasi of Levi. Meaning, under the guise of egalitarianism, everybody is really arguing for their own self-interest. It's quite amazing. And in this connection, there's a famous pshat in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. The Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says, Kol machlokas shehi l'shem shamayim, sofo le'iskayim. Every machlokas, every disagreement that is for the sake of Hashem will continue to endure. Now that's a positive statement. We will learn from it. We will study it. We will analyze it. We will preserve the different views. But when you have a machlokas that's not for the sake of heaven, the parties will be disgraced. They will live in infamy. Now the Mishnah then goes on and says, what is an example of a machlokas l'shem shamayim? This is the machlokas Hillel and Shammai, right? Hillel and Shammai, and later the yeshivos of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. They argue in many, many things, hundreds and hundreds of disputes. Now it's true that 99% of the time the halacha is like Beis Hillel, but we continue to study Beis Shammai, we analyze Beis Shammai, we ask kashas and terutzim. That's called Sofo L'Iskayim. Hillel and Shammai were L'Shem Shamayim. Both views are makubal and studied. And what's an example of a machlokas shelo L'Shem Shamayim? Zu Korach v'Adaso. Korach and his congregation, who were disgraced. So the Meforshim asked the kasha that the Mishnah is asymmetrical here, because when the Mishnah describes a machlokas l'shem shamayim, it uses both sides, Hillel ve'Shammai. When it says machlokas shelo l'shem shamayim, it should have said Korach in Moshe, Korach against Moshe. It doesn't say it. It says Korach v'Adasa. In other words, it only gives you one side. Why doesn't it say Korach u'Moshe? Now, one could give a simple answer, that if it would have said Korach u'Moshe, that might have implied that both sides were not l'shem shamayim. And it didn't want to say that, so it only said the side that was not l'shem shamayim. But they say b'shem the Chasam Sofer another pshat, that when you have a machlokas not l'shem shamayim, even the people on the same side are really fighting against each other. In other words, Korach's own Eidah, they had different wishes. It's like, well, I mean, Lahavdil, I don't want to compare Korach to the Arabs, but it's like, the Arabs unify, the Arab nations unify when they want to attack Israel or kill Jews. But the truth of the matter is, that distracts them from their other alternative focus of killing and destroying each other. Meaning to say, when you have people that are not l'shem shamayim, the truth is they're even fighting against themselves. There's no particular unity even among themselves, except for the common enemy that they have, that unfortunately happens to be us. So that's one of the lessons you see from Korach. And the truth of the matter is, this is sometimes a subconscious process. Sometimes we think we are acting for noble spiritual goals, but we're really acting of our own personal desire for glory and ego gratification. For example, sometimes you'll often hear people say, and I've said it myself at times, let's say somebody hurt you, somebody cheated you, somebody offended you. So you might say to something, I'm not angry because it's me, I'm just angry as a matter of principle. But the question becomes, if it's a matter of principle, then, there are gazillions of people that are hurt every single day. Why are you not so upset over all of the wrongdoings that occur in the world? Why are we upset only when it happens to me? The answer has to be, it's not a matter of principle, it's a matter of me. And yet we try to convince ourselves we are acting, l'shem shamayim, when in fact it's not. So in this connection, I want to share with you a very, very interesting and enigmatic gematria of the Arizal. That the Ari does not explain it all, he just gives you this gematria. The Arizal points out that the gematria of Moshe is 345. The gematria of Korach is 308. The difference between them is 37, and 37 is the same gematria as Hevel. Hevel, Cain's brother, Hevel also means vapor, air, breath. So mathematically, this would mean the following. Moshe minus Hevel equals Korach, or alternatively, Korach plus Hevel equals Moshe. But the Arizal does not explain what does this mean. What is the significance of 345, and what's 308, and why is Hevel coming in here? So the Shem Mishmuel says the following thing. The Shem Mishmuel explains the Ari this way. That we know that, of course, the Ari and the Mekubalim very much believed and taught the idea of Gilgul. Gilgul Neshamot means reincarnation. That Neshamot come back to this world many, many times in order to complete the mission that they were given. By the way, people always ask me, is Gilgul an absolute article of faith? I mean, the answer is, Gilgul is not per se one of the 13 principles of faith. It is not mentioned in the Gemara, and it is not mentioned in the Medrash, and Rav Sadia Gaon did not believe in reincarnation. But nevertheless, the Mekubalim very much taught it, and it's become accepted as a Jewish belief. So the Arizal says the following idea. Let's go back to the first murder in the world, the murder of that Cain perpetrated against Hevel. So he says Cain and Hevel represent two personality types, two prototypes of personality, in which each one has a certain side that's very important. Why was Cain called Cain? Because Chava said, Kanisi ish, I have acquired or I have created a human being from Hashem. So the name Cain represents creation, acquisition, domination. Cain represents that force within the human being that is ego-driven, that wants to create, wants to dominate. Now that's not totally bad. Without that element of ego in the world, we would be very, very passive. We would not drain the swamps. We would not build the cities. We would not combat injustice. Because we would essentially say, good in some ways is very passive. You say, let Hashem take care of things. In many, many ways, at least the physical and technological progress of mankind depends on a certain amount of egotism. And Cain represents that force of egotism, where unfortunately it goes too far, results in violence and violating the rights of others. But in its root, the idea of koniti ish im Hashem, to acquire, to create, to dominate, has a certain role to play in the world as long as it is subject to morality and submission to God. Hevel is exactly the opposite. Hevel represents the passivity, like breath. Breath is ethereal. Breath has no substance you can hold on to. Right? So breath, Hevel, futility, represents the opposite. If Kanisi is the power of ego, Hevel represents submission to God. And Hevel was killed. Now let me point out that you see, even in Avodas Hashem, Cain was a greater innovator than Hevel. Because if we ask the question, Who was the person who invented korbanos? Who was the one who figured out that Hashem got pleasure from the sacrifices we make to him? It was Cain. Cain invented the korban. Hevel took Cain's idea and improved it by bringing the best. But Cain is the innovator. Hevel is the follower. But Hevel represents goodness because goodness is submission. But Hevel was killed. And Hevel's neshama needed a tikkun. And the reason Hevel's neshama needed a tikkun is because submission to God alone results in passivity and paralysis. And it has to somehow be joined with leadership and initiative. That was Hevel's unfinished business. Hevel was a tzaddik, but Hevel needed to incorporate some aspect of Cain within his personality. So the Arizal says elsewhere that Moshe Rabbeinu was a Gilgal of Hevel. Now, we know that Moshe Rabbeinu had the Hevel quality of Anava, humility, because the Pasuk says, right, Moshe was Anav Mikol Adam. But Moshe Rabbeinu did not let his Anava make him passive. Moshe was a leader. Moshe was able to take the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. Moshe Rabbeinu was fearless in doing his job. Moshe Rabbeinu understood that Anava does not mean you're ineffectual. It does not mean you're passive. It does not mean you don't step up to the plate and be proactive in doing God's work in the world. That Anava does not have to be the paralysis of indecision. And therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu rectified the chisaron in Hevel by combining within him the good of Cain, which infused Hevel's humility. So, seen in this way, here is the point that the Shem Shmuel says, explaining the Ari. In many, many ways, Korach was as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. Korach was a man of unbelievable greatness. He had every quality that Moshe Rabbeinu had, except one. He didn't have the Hevel quality. He didn't have the humility. He was too consumed with his gaiva and his ego. So now, the math is perfect. What is Moshe? Korach plus Hevel gives you Moshe. What is Korach? Moshe minus Hevel. Meaning Korach was Moshe's equal, except in that quality of Hevel, humility and submission. Now in that sense, the Greeks defined tragedy in a very special, we still use the expression Greek tragedy, that tragedy is not simply something sad happens. Sad things can happen to anybody, but tragedy is when there's a certain potential for greatness, but there's a flaw within that person that prevents that greatness from being realized. We call that a Greek tragedy. Lahavdil, Korach is actually a Greek tragedy. Korach was a man of greatness, a man of tremendous spiritual potential. But the flaw was his ego and his gaiva and his conceit. And that destroyed him from within. In fact, the Gemara tells us, not the Gemara, the Medrash tells us, who have to understand this, that Korach was the one person in history who understood the mystery of the Para Aduma, the red heifer. Moshe didn't fully comprehend it, Shlomo HaMelech didn't comprehend it, Korach got it! Korach was also phenomenally wealthy. In fact, in Yiddish, there's even an expression to this day, if a person is wealthy, like Bill Gates is now filthy rich. We say, Reich wie Korach, you're as rich as Korach. So Korach had it all. But then you get destroyed from a flaw that's within. We see this, right? We see this. In fact, without getting into specifics.
What was the gematria of Korach?
Korach is 308. So that's Moshe minus Hevel. Hevel is 37. So, right, that's...
And what was Moshe?
Korach plus Hevel equals 1.
That's correct. That's right. That's exactly right. That's
How
exactly
much
right.
was Moshe?
345. You see? So if you put in the Hevel, the Korach, you get Moshe. Right? Yeah. This is what the Shemish says. Now, I want to point out that Korach, in a sense, was also he was misled by a nevuah that he had about his future descendants. You remember that the ground opened up, Korach died, and Korach's sons fell into the pit as well. But the last minute they did Shuvah, and they were saved. There was like a ledge that saved them. And they emerged from the pit, and they eventually had children, descendants. And those descendants became the main Leviim in the Beis HaMikdash that would sing songs of praise to Hashem. And in fact, they were composers of Tehillim. There are 11 chapters of Tehillim that were composed by Bnei Korach. One of them we recite before Tekiyah Shofar and Rosh Hashanah, when it says Lav Natseach, to the conductor, Livnei Korach, to the composed by the children of Korach. This is not some other Korach. This is the Korach whose the ground opened up. And not only that, but the Navi Shemuel. The Navi Shemuel was a descendant of Korach. What do we know about Shemuel? Well, David says in Tehillim, we say this Kabbalah Shabbos, Moshe v'Aaron v'Chohanav. Moshe and Aaron are the priests who serve God. Moshe is also called the Kohen. U'Shmuel v'Korei Shmo. And Shmuel is among those who call to Hashem. And the Gemara explains it's like a scale. Moshe and Aaron are on one side of the scale, and Shmuel is on the other. And Shmuel is Shakul to Moshe v'Aaron. We don't even know what that means. Shmuel was equal. Moshe and Aaron together. So the Midrash says, Korach looks at all his wonderful holy descendants, and he says, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. If I have all these wonderful descendants, it must be because of me. Ignoring the other influences that come in. And of course, there's another catch-22. Maybe his descendants became so righteous because they saw what happened to Korach. That could be an experience that brings you to a very high level of Shuvah. And this raises, by the way, a philosophical question I will just throw out for you to think about. I'm not going to answer it. I don't necessarily have an answer. That is the difficult intersection between prophecy of the future and free will. Because here we have a difficult situation. Korach has a prophetic vision of the righteous tzaddikim that he will have in the future. But we believe in free will, so any one of those people who became righteous tzaddikim, once they were born, once they grew up, they had free will to become Rishonim or tzaddikim. Now how does that work? If Korach already knows they're going to be tzaddikim, then how does that play with the free will they're going to have later? Now, you may recall that this was the same question we raised in reverse last week when we talked about how Eldad Umeidad already prophesied that Moshe would die and Yoshua would bring them into Eretz Yisrael. Now the problem is, the reason Moshe didn't go to Eretz Yisrael is because 40 years later, he commits a sin by hitting the rock instead of speaking to it. But that sin didn't occur yet, and when the 40 years comes, Moshe Rabbeinu has free will not to commit the sin, and if he wouldn't have committed the sin, he might have been able to enter Eretz Yisrael. So how could there be a prophecy he's not going to enter Eretz Yisrael? Doesn't that prophecy foreclose free will? Or to give you a third example of this particular phenomenon, you remember the righteous king Chizkiyahu, and Chizkiyahu did not want to get married because he saw B'Ruach HaKodesh that he would have a son that would be a Rasha, and the Navi Yeshayahu told him, you're going to die because you're not fulfilling Pru Urvu. Eventually he did get married. He married Yeshayahu's daughter, and indeed he had a son that was a Rasha. Now here's the question. Are we to assume that Menashe was predestined to be an evil person? That would be a contradiction. So there are going to be, in all of these cases, there are going to be contradictions between the content of a prophecy and the ability of human beings to exercise free will. But of course, even without prophecy, you have the problem because God knows the future. I mean, even if nobody had the prophecy, you'd have the same problem at that higher level. So I'm not going to address that now, but other to say that once again, this is an example of Korach being led astray by the arrogance and the gaiva that destroyed him from within. A person of very, very great potential. And again, we've seen it. There are sometimes great rabbis. In fact, it's sometimes they call it the curse of charisma. That when you have rabbis who are extremely charismatic, so sometimes you can believe your own hype, and that could result in various forms of abuse and improprieties and crossing boundaries. And again, Dailachtima Bermiza, about different types of scandals that have emerged precisely from that. In fact, that's what they say. They say the Alter Slobodka, I'm not sure what it means exactly, but he says he tried to cultivate a very boring speaking style. They say that he wanted people to only concentrate on the content of what he said. No pyrotechnics, no fancy things, no salesmanship, no marketing, because he said all of that was a distraction and that could lead a person astray. So he was talking in monotone, and I'm not sure exactly, but that's how it's described. That he did not want to be dramatic in anything that he did, because he just wanted people to hear the actual thoughts and focus on the thoughts. Again, in the modern world, maybe we're too superficial, so we need to have a little bit of pizzazz on some level. But in an ideal sense, it should be the idea that matters and not the packaging in any way. So Korach winds up in the ground, and that was that. But then there was a final test that occurred, and this is to reaffirm the primacy of Aaron. And that is, each of the heads of the tribes was to take a staff, and the staffs were put in the Kodesh HaKodashim, or at least in the Mishkan. And then the next morning, they took out the staffs, and the staff of Aaron miraculously sprouted flowers and buds and even almonds, even completed fruits, and none of the other staffs had anything. And this was the sign that Hashem had chosen Aaron. Now the pasuk says an interesting thought. The pasuk then says, and every Nasi then took his staff and brought it to his home. So Rav Zalman Soroskian asks an interesting question. It's like a lottery ticket. Like if 12 people buy a lottery ticket, and only one person wins, you don't save the old lottery ticket, you throw it away. Why was it that every Nasi took their staff home? It was a worthless piece of wood. Let them just throw it away. I mean, they kind of had a contest. Who would God choose? And each one might have thought that maybe God would choose them somehow. And God chose Aaron. So your staff is a stick. Why bother keeping it? So Zalman Soroskian says an interesting thing. Zalman Soroskian actually says that this group of Nesiim was not like Korach. This group of Nesiim genuinely wanted a chance to serve God. Their kavanah was l'shem shamayim. They wanted to have the role of a Levi. Now, Zalman Soroskian pointed out that the life of a Levi, at least when we get to Eretz Yisrael, is not an easy life. The Levi doesn't own land. The Levi needs to be supported by the community through maser and various other things. A Levi would often be poor. A Levi is devoted to Torah learning. A Levi lives a poor life. When you're not a Levi, you have the opportunity for all sorts of economic growth and prosperity. But their kavanah was that they wanted to serve Hashem, and they were willing to live lives of poverty and deprivation in order to serve God. So Rav Zalman Soroskian says very beautifully, they took home their staffs to remind and to teach their children. I want you to know, let's say, right, imagine that 50 years from now they're living in a big mansion, with furniture and all sorts of fancy things. But they have that stick, and they're effectively telling their children, you know, I was willing to give all of this up to be a Levi. And that was my attempt to try to be a Levi, even though I was not chosen. And I want you to know what the most important thing in life is. He says, it's a very beautiful thought, that we have a wonderful life, but I was going to give everything up if I could be a servant of Hashem like a Levi. And as Zalman Sorokin said, that's kind of a chinuch that you have to give your children. That if Baruch Hashem, you know, we're able to live with a certain reasonable level of prosperity, but we want to communicate that for Avodat Hashem, it would be worthwhile to give up everything if we had to. Baruch Hashem, most of the time, we're not called upon to make those types of sacrifices. But even if we were, it would be worth it. Right? That is the notion of why they kept their staff and they put it over the mantelpiece, they put it over the fireplace, as it were, as a reminder to them and a lesson to their children what they would be willing to give up. And you know, that's kind of the lesson of Korach. One final point, though. After all of this is done, the end of the Parsha, we have 24 gifts, 24 matanot that Hashem gave to the Kohanim. You know, you give them truma, you give them many, many different things. And the Torah does not use the number 24, but there's a total of 24 different entitlements that Kohanim and Leviim get. One of the most familiar that we still practice today is, of course, Pidyon Haben, right? When we redeem the firstborn boy, so we give 5 Selaim to a Kohen. So here, there's a thought from Rav Tzadok that's actually a very interesting thought. The concept of Pidyon is redemption. Now, the concept of redemption is a familiar concept in many places in the Torah. For example, if you separate Maser Sheni, the second tithe that you're supposed to bring to Yerushalayim to eat in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, if you live too far away to carry the food is going to spoil. So what you do is you take money, you transfer the holiness from the fruit to the money. So the fruit is now chulin, so you can eat it wherever you want to eat it. And you bring the money to Yerushalayim, and you buy food there, and you eat it. That's called pidyon. So what is pidyon? Pidyon means you take the holiness off one object, you transfer it onto the other object, and what you've done is you've deconsecrated the first object. Seen in that sense, the paradigm of pidyon doesn't really work when you redeem a firstborn. Because let's say I didn't redeem my firstborn. In what way is he holy? Now, there is a Sephorno that actually says an amazing thing. If you don't redeem your firstborn child,
He has to redeem himself.
well, that's true, but what is his holiness if he didn't redeem himself? The Sephorno actually says an unredeemed Bechor is not allowed to do profane work. So if I have a firstborn son that I did not redeem, I cannot tell him to take out the garbage or clean up the room. That itself creates a tremendous incentive to redeem my Bechor. But we don't paskin that way. We paskin that even before he's redeemed, there's no prohibition in him. Moreover, I should also say the other thing is also true. Pidyon normally means the holiness goes off one object and onto the other object. But you know, the money you give the Kohen is not holy. The Kohen can use it to buy a Coca-Cola, meaning the Kohen can use the money for whatever he wants to use it for. So Rav Tzadok says, it's not truly a redemption process. But what's going on is, the holiness of the Kohen is a different type of holiness than the holiness of a Bechor. The holiness of a Bechor is the holiness of almost accidental circumstance. Why is a Bechor holy? Because when God killed all the firstborn of Egypt, and God did not kill the firstborn of the Israelites, every Bechor was holy because he was miraculously saved by unique divine providence. It was nothing the Bechor did. It was nothing the Bechor accomplished. He was the passive recipient of divine providence. And for that reason, the Bechor became holy. The holiness of Kohanim and Leviim is a different holiness. Although it is true that today it's genetic. Today it's passed on automatically. But at its inception, it was the holiness of choice. That by the Chet HaEgel, although Aaron was involved in the Chet HaEgel, but by the Chet HaEgel, when Moshe Rabbeinu said, Mi Lashem Elai, who will stand up for the glory of God? Shevet Levi stood up for the glory of Hashem. And they were chosen. So, Bechor represents the holiness of passive status. Levi represents the holiness of the choices that you make in life. Now, the word kesef, money, has a double meaning. It's a bit of a biblical pun. Kesef means money, but lichsof also means to yearn, to desire. Kisufin. When Lavan, when he hears that Yaakov wants to go home after 20 years, Lavan's language is nichsof, nichsafta. You're yearning to go home. And you did nefesh. We say nichsof, nichsafti. I'm yearning to be connected to Hashem. So, looking at it in a Hasidic type of drush, when the father of the Bechor gives kesef to the Kohen, it's a bit of a drush. The way we interpret it is this way. The father of the Bechor is expressing kisufin, that the holiness of passive status should be transformed into the holiness of active choice. Yes, my son was born holy, but my desire is he's not just holy because he was born a certain way. I want him to be holy so he shall be a certain way. And the truth of the matter is, this is true for every Jew, even if you're not a Bechor. Every Jew is born holy. But the true holiness is not what we're born with. The true holiness is the life that we make by our choices. So the derech drush, kisufin, is the yearning that the holiness of my son the Bechor should be analogous to the holiness of the Kohen, which was a matter of choice.
What about a Bechor who was born from a C-section? Still a Bechor.
Doesn't get read.
Yeah, there's no pigeon a bed. Yeah.
Or set up a lady.
You know, I don't know if I'm not sure I have a reason for it. I mean, the Gemara darshans it because the Bechor is called Pater Rechem, the one that opens the womb, so it has to go through the womb and not through some
Still has the
artificial.
status of Bechor in terms of Yerushin.
Yes, but remember the definition. Actually not. We actually paskin. That's interesting. A lot of people don't know this. But a Peter Rechem does not get a double portion either. The Gemara has the drushes. Now, but of course you understand that the Bechor for Yerusha is a totally different getter. That a Bechor who gets a double portion is the Bechor of the father, even if it's not the Bechor of the mother. So, if a man who never had children marries a woman that had children, his firstborn son from his wife will get a double portion of inheritance, even though there's no pidyon haben. And the opposite is true as well. If a man with children marries a woman who never had children, her firstborn will need a pidyon haben, even though it's not the firstborn of the father. Now that is true. But for the C-section, that's Xeris HaKosef. In fact, other things are strange. I don't know the reasons. I mean, these are drushas from Sukkim. You know, a C-section baby does not have a Shabbos bris. You know that. C-section baby is born on Shabbos. The bris has to be on Sunday. Now, why that's so in Svara, I don't know if I could say. I don't know. But the Gemara has drushos on a lot of these things. So this is the story of Korach, and again it reminds us to be very cognizant of our hidden agendas and to try to be honest to ourselves. As the Kutzker Rebbe would say, Midvar sheker tirchak. Distance yourself from a lie. The most important thing is, do not be a liar to yourself. Even if you fool other people, at least know what you're doing and attempt to be honest. So have a good week and a good Shabbos.